Now from Denver, let's bring in the Dean of the School of International Studies, the University of Denver, former U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, and former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Christopher Hill. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. Katty Kay has the first question for you.
Chris, when you listen to the president tonight talking about Afghanistan, what will it be that makes you convinced that the White House actually does have a strategy for Afghanistan that differs significantly from that of either George Bush or Barack Obama and gives America some kind of coherent long-term goal and plan in the country?
Well, you know, it used to be said that Afghanistan was a good war and Iraq was a bad war, and I think everyone's kind of concluded that Iraq was a bad war and Afghanistan was the worst war. And certainly this president wanted nothing to do with this and kind of turned it over to his Secretary of Defense. And I think what's pretty clear is the Secretary of Defense said, look, we'll work out a strategy, but you have to be a part of it and you have to announce it. So I think what is probably going on, and I think this represents Mr. Mattis's approach to all this, is that this needs to be set in a regional context. You're not going to solve Afghanistan without figuring out how you're going to deal with some of the Taliban allies. You need to understand how this works with the Gulf states, but also how this works with Qatar, because they've also helped the Taliban over the years. And, you know, everyone hates the subject of Pakistan. They hate dealing with Pakistan on this issue. Pakistan has not been helpful on these issues of trying to, hold down the Taliban, but we're going to have to deal with them. So I think we're going to see a strategy that will be kind of broad-based in terms of the region. I think that's a good sign. I think we're going to see a lot of tough love for the Afghan government, and I think that's probably coming from the president, who probably can't stand dealing with the Afghan government as well. So it's just one of those things that one has to do, that has come through and say what we're going to do in Afghanistan. I mean, probably increasing 5,000 troops on top of the 8,000 troops. No one thinks this is going to make some historical difference, but it might buy some time, and with a strategy that really tells the Afghan government, we're going to give you some more time, but we're not going to give you forever, right, and tries to get the region involved. I think it's probably going to be that type of strategy.
Heidi Przybyla is with us from Washington and has a question. Heidi.
Ambassador, how is this strategy essentially going to look any different than Barack Obama in 2010? And like you said, Trump very much ran on getting us out of conflicts like this. Barack Obama obviously wanted it out. When is it time for the president, if we're going to have to be there as a nation for another decade or so, to essentially level with the American people and tell them that?
Well, I think the president, you know, if he had his druthers, we'd probably be out. But I think his advisors have convinced him that having helicopters leaving the roof of the embassy is probably not something he wants to see during his term. You know, after all, he's been in over 6 months. He can't blame everything on Obama. So I think he essentially is going to have to kind of deal with a problem out there, and realizing that a bigger problem would be the perception that we have lost and lost now. So I think what is different here is a measure of real tough love with the Afghan government. I mean, really kind of telling them they got to step up on this. Secondly, I think we're going to probably talk a little less about issues that frankly have been there for several thousand years, such as corruption. I mean, corruption didn't just descend on them from Mars a couple of years ago. I mean, corruption has been there for centuries, and this idea that we're going to wag our finger at Afghan government and get them to do more on this is probably not going to happen. So I think you'll see a real note of realism, and I think thanks to General Mattis, perhaps a note of more regionalism in trying to address this.
Mark Halperin.
Ambassador, switching to Korea, if you look since the latest round of back and forth and the rhetoric and some of the military activity, how would you look at, from a U.S. point of view, how the North Korean leadership has acted, how the Chinese leadership has acted? Is there any encouraging sign in either of those two countries in terms of how they've dealt with American statements?
Well, I see nothing encouraging about the North Koreans. I mean, sure, they kind of pulled back by from the idea they're going to surround Guam in a sea of fire. I think, that was never really happening. So I don't really see much encouraging from the North Koreans. I think they have merrily gone about trying to produce deliverable nuclear weapons now for years, and I don't see any change there. I don't think it was helpful to have President Trump sounding like a North Korean himself with fire and fury Korea and stuff like that. I think that kind of allowed the Chinese to say, hey, kids, calm this down, and including the United States. So I think the onus needs to be kept on the North Koreans. As for the actual exercise, look, we have these exercises every year. They're very important to making sure our militaries work together. And the idea we're going to cancel exercises in the hopes that North Korea will somehow nod their approval, I think is frankly not a strategy and not a policy.
Harold Ford.
Ambassador Harold Ford, good morning. Quickly, Bannon on the way out was quoted as saying that there's no military option, realistic military option in North Korea. Do you agree with that?
You know, I think probably this is the first time in my life where I have to say I agree more with Bannon than I do with others on this point. But I think there is scope for doing something in the narrow space between peace and war. But to go after North Korea in a kind of preemptive strike and to essentially invite them to launch artillery against 20 million South Korean citizens, the worst thing, of course, would be where we don't even tell the South Korean government we're going to do that because we want the element of surprise. But I think the second worst thing is telling them, because then they would refuse, and then we'd have a major row with our partners. So I don't see any real scope for this type of military solution. I do think we need to figure out how to slow down this thing through cyber attacks, through whatever attacks within peace and war, between peace and war.
All right, Ambassador Christopher Hill, thank you so much as always. We love having you on the show. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.